Welcome to the Bible Made Clear. So, this is part 3 of our Bible Basics class, and trying to keep this high level. And it's difficult because I always want to add more content, but we have come to the place where we are going to kind of do a quick walk through the books of the Old Testament, just to give you some highlights from each book. I can't get into it much, obviously, because it would be a whole Bible survey class, which, I mean, if people want that, I can certainly do that here and put it up. It's just what people feel their biggest need and of what they need to understand is. So as we go through here now, the Old Testament, and I will try to finish the Old Testament up today. The law is 5 books. It's called the Pentateuch, Pena meaning 5, right? 5 books of the law. Starts with Genesis. Now, certainly you can read through these yourself. You don't need me to read them to you. But you're basically, Genesis is going to establish the beginning of the reason for so many things that need to be concluded in the book of Revelation. And I mean, there's the beginning of sin. Why do we have marriage? Well, obviously God instituted it, and it began on the other side of sin in the Garden of Eden. So marriage is really the only thing that carries over, in a sense, that continues without being affected in any sense other than by our sin natures, certainly. But, God, he didn't change anything with marriage, okay? He instituted it, and it's supposed to be ideally one man for one woman for one life. But, again, we don't want to get into the weeds too much on this stuff. But from there, from the time that Genesis 3:15, right after sin, that the first prophecy of the coming of a deliverer, somebody who would reconcile to God, save people from the sin that just entered into the world, the curse that's been brought on through Adam's sin, the seed of the woman. It begins there in Genesis 3:15, and there's a trail. It will work its way through the Old Testament in genealogy. So as you track through Genesis, there's a number of things that are accomplished, but one of the main features is we're watching God put together the way to track who this deliverer is. And, as the genealogical connection comes out of the garden, goes through the flood with Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth with his kids, and then it's through Shem, and then from Shem's offspring, then you have, eventually he picks Abraham from the Ur of the Chaldees, creates the nation of Israel. Now, Israel came from Jacob, though Jews worked their descendants back to Abraham. Abraham had 2 sons. Jacob, Isaac, his son, had 2 sons. It goes through Jacob, and then from Jacob, his children fathered the 12 tribes of Israel, which then, focuses the Messianic connection genealogically through the tribe of Judah. And so we follow that on through the New Testament. It reduces down to David's family for that kingly dynasty. And then we get the location where he's going to be born in Bethlehem from Micah 5:2. In Isaiah 7:14, we get the fact that he'll be born of a virgin. And then we also find out when he's coming from Daniel 9:27, 173,880 days from the time that Nehemiah goes forth to get the command from Artaxerxes in the book of Nehemiah chapter 2 to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. So that's Daniel 9:25 through the end of the chapter, 27. So there's so much information, but that's tracking through. It's the Messiah's bloodline, effectively. So when you get to the New Testament, Matthew, he'll work his genealogy back to Abraham, so the Jews will listen to what he's actually trying to tell them through his gospel. And Luke, interestingly enough, because he's focusing on something different, he'll work his genealogy all the way back to Adam, so you can follow it in that way. But Genesis is the creation of the world, and then in chapter 12 we get the creation of a nation with the nation of Israel. And there's so many keys, but I put down here the unconditional covenant promise God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as it relates to the creation of the nation of Israel. And the reason that that's important is because there's so much confusion about, Israel today. Should Christians support it, not support it, and everything? Of course we should support it. God made different covenants with the nation of Israel. We have the Abrahamic covenant for land, seed, and blessing, seed meaning descendants to go into that land. And then sometimes the seed is singular. Paul pulls that out for Galatians, meaning he's talking about Christ, the deliverer, because everything is fulfilled in Christ. All the prophecies, everything that, culminated really in him. The old covenant pointed to him, right? He fulfilled it. But anyway, so you have the nation of Israel with these different covenants. Now, the Abrahamic covenant that God made with him is unilateral, one-sided. Abraham really, his obedience created an enjoyment in walking in the blessing of that covenant. However, that covenant itself is it's unilateral. It's a one-sided covenant, and the other one-sided covenant is the land covenant, which again it gets developed, in Deuteronomy, and at the end of Deuteronomy, and then finally in the book of Jeremiah, it's developed and talked about. As well as Ezekiel mentions it, but the point is that these are one-sided covenants. You also get a one-sided covenant with the covenant made to David in 1 Samuel or 2 Samuel 7. That's developed a little bit more in 1 Chronicles, but in 2 Samuel 7, David wants to build a house for God. God says, I'll build you a house. And he explains that the house is his descendants. He's not talking about a building. So God's going to establish the dynasty of David with the Messianic dynasty. And so again, that tracks all the way through. So there's a lot going on in the Old Testament, but it starts in Genesis. Without Genesis, the rest of the Bible doesn't make any sense. I've heard teachers say, well, you don't need the Old Testament. That's a lie. You can't even fully understand the New Testament without the Old Testament. The New Testament has no foundation without the Old Testament. The New Testament is a fulfillment of what the Old Testament's talking about. There's no way to connect the dots. You would be, chopping the legs off of the Bible to eliminate the Old Testament. Just because, now again, I've mentioned 3 covenants that the Jews are still under, right? Abrahamic, the land covenant, and the Davidic covenant. So those are still in effect. They will work their way through the millennial reign, okay? Now, when they get the law of Moses, that was a bilateral covenant. In other words, technically they call it a suzerain vassal covenant, but in other words, you have two sides. God has his side to fulfill. The people have theirs. When both sides, and in this sense, when Israel is obedient to what God laid out and they agreed to, then he would bless them. When he didn't, they would be cursed. Now that's the agreement. It's, I hate to call it a business agreement because it's really not that, but it's like that in the sense, if I hired you to paint my house and I said, okay, I'm going to give you a third when you start so that you can buy materials. I'll give you a third when you're halfway through, and I'll give you the rest when you're completed. Now I have the money. I'm ready to pay you. I pay you the first third. I pay you the second third. And then, after you get the second third, you're just a little bit over halfway and you say, hey, I'd like the rest of my money. And I say, well, I'll give you your money, but I'll give it to you when you're done. That was the agreement. Well, I want the money now. Well, but you're not done now. It's not that I don't want to give it to you. It's not that I won't give it to you. I just won't give it to you now. That's not the agreement. I will hold up my end of the contract. You hold up yours. Okay. And that's really what it was with Israel. God wanted to bless them. It was his intention to and his desire to, but they needed to complete the job. They needed to get to the end of the painting. Okay. So, they needed to be obedient in order to receive those blessings. So, that's the only bilateral covenant, and that's the one that gets replaced with the new covenant. Now, the ultimate new covenant is really between God and Israel, Jeremiah 31. So, and again, that's developed in other places other than Jeremiah. It's in Ezekiel and mentioned there, but that is between God and Israel. The new covenant that we are kind of grafted into and experiencing today is not all exactly what was promised to Israel, okay? Because the 1,000-year reign, the millennial reign of Christ, is where the new covenant God promised to the nation of Israel will be applied and fulfilled, okay? Does the church have a connection to it? Absolutely, but it is not prophesied or written for the church in the Old Testament, which again is why the church is a mystery in the New Testament, and we need to distinguish Israel and the church. They're not the same. They don't have the same purposes in the world. They don't have the same prophetic plan or anything else, all right? So they're distinct, and recognizing that will help us to understand the proper framework for Israel and for the church. But the church never becomes Israel. Israel never becomes the church. They are separate. They will always be separate. They were created separate for separate reasons, with separate plans. So anyways, Genesis begins it all. We get to the end of Genesis. We're in Egypt. The Jews are allowed to develop and multiply in Egypt, and then they are brought out with Moses. That's where the law is instituted in Exodus 19. They agree to it. Exodus 20, Moses comes down with the 10 Commandments. And then the rest of Exodus is how to make the tabernacle and the furniture. And I had showed you pictures of that, in previous slides. Leviticus, they're still at Mount Sinai. They get the first 7 chapters are the 5 sacrifices. 2 of them mandatory, the sin offering, the trespass offering. The other 3 are voluntary. The sin offering, because we're sinners by nature. Trespass offering, because those are our acts. So, in a sense, the sin offering is because of the fact of sin, that we have a sin nature. The trespass offering is the acts of sin, because we have sinful acts because we're sinners. We have sinful natures. By the end of Leviticus, there are 7 feasts. In Leviticus 23, they're laid out. So the sacrifices help Israel as a nation to be sanctified in their approach to God and their relationship with God. And then the feasts help them abide in God throughout the year, remembering what God has done for them. And if you don't remember anything else off of this slide, remember this, that the law was not given to save people, but to saved people. The law was not given to redeem Israel, but to a redeemed Israel. Israel was redeemed by blood. Nobody is redeemed without blood. Nobody gets saved by good works. From the garden to the millennial reign, people are saved by simple faith. All right? How their faith is applied depends on what dispensation they are in. And based on that dispensation that they are in, and I have a short series on dispensations that you can look up on the channel. But if you have a Scofield Bible, old or new Scofield, they both have the dispensations listed out in them. I think that they do a good job with the 7. Some people see a couple less, some people can see a couple more, but I think the Scofield Bible probably represents well the dispensational view. I think if you try to look at the Bible through covenant theology, it is confusing, and you are required to non-literalize literal scriptures. In other words, you have to allegorize or spiritualize many of the texts and many of the things that are laid out, and things become very, very confusing. However, if you look at the Bible the way it's laid out, then you can then take a look and then see that it is laid out dispensationally. I know, today a lot of dispensational views get really bad names. They try to associate us with, crazy as it is, anti-Semitism, which is the very opposite. Dispensationalists are the ones that support Israel, where covenant theologians don't, okay? And they are into replacement theology. So dispensationalism, once you understand the Bible, you don't have to read it into it. It is a natural byproduct of discovering what the Bible is teaching, okay? And the dispensations are just different eras and in what is laid down by God to reveal whether there's real faith in a person's life or not, is really what the bottom line is. So when you're under the dispensation of law, like Moses' law, people were not saved by keeping the law. It was saved people that were sanctified by observing the law, and the law was there to the sanctification of the nation of Israel. And it was through the law that people learned and were instructed and were prepared for the Messiah, right? Paul brings this out in the book of Galatians. So the law was never a means of redemption. It was for the redeemed people, okay? And we need to kind of keep that in mind as we go through it, because if people had genuine faith and they were under the law, then certainly they tried to observe the law, which demonstrated their faith, okay? But people are never saved by works or anything else. And, it's no different. You look at people in church today and you say, gee, that person's been coming to church for a while. They still seem kind of carnal, and I don't know if they're saved or they're not, and they could very well be saved. I mean, we can't see their heart, only God can. We can only deal with what we observe. But then you can see somebody that's going to church for a while, seems to live right, do the right thing, as far as what you know. They say they're saved, and you take them at their word, but they could be not even believing in their heart, So we only have certain things we can measure by, because we're on the outside looking in. But God is the only one that sees on the inside. So we just We just have to view by behavior, but that's why we can't determine everybody who absolutely is or isn't saved, right? But anyways, Leviticus, they're still there. Again, I have a video on the book of Leviticus itself. Each of these, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they're just brief overviews that you can watch on the channel, and they basically kind of explain the books. But the center of the book of Leviticus is the Day of Atonement, and everything kind of surrounds it, the way it's laid out. So the Day of Atonement is obviously key to the book, where the high priest is introduced, his job, which Christ is our high priest. So there's many, many applicable things looking forward. Those are a shadow of what was to come that did come, which is Christ. The book of Numbers, they're still at Mount Sinai until chapter 10, and then they start moving towards, Midian, Kadesh Barnea. So it talks about their wanderings when they reject going into the land, and God has the generation from 20 years old and above wander around in the desert until they die off. 40 years later, he brings them in. Now, at the end of Leviticus, at the end of Numbers, we then have Deuteronomy, and it is the end of the 40-year wandering. Moses has the generation in front of him that are going to enter into the land, and he rehearses their history, gives them their national identity, and their doctrinal understanding of the law, and that is developed throughout the book of Deuteronomy, and then the blessings and curses for keeping or not keeping the law are given at the end of the book, along with other instructions and some prophecy regarding Israel's future and how they are going to fail and be distributed around the world, and then eventually brought back to their land, which they are today, though they're in unbelief today. The tribulation period will change all that and bring them to faith. So the law lays down the foundation for the entire rest of the Bible. Though Christians are not under the law, and only the nation of Israel was under the law, and the law was replaced for the church by the new covenant, and then in our relationship to what the new covenant is, though it is not exactly the new covenant as it's described for Israel. Israel receives the new covenant in the millennial kingdom, and Jeremiah 31 will be fulfilled, at that point. So the law is important because it pictures so much, it anticipates so much, and it lays down the foundation for how the nation is to understand God, sin, righteousness, judgment, themselves, interrelationships, what nations are all about, what, the principles of governance and redemption, right? Though the law didn't redeem anybody, it had all the principles of redemption in it. And listen, the tabernacle, which eventually was the temple in Jerusalem, there's a real one in heaven, because when Moses in Exodus 20 was up on the mountain, he was given a pattern. God said, make sure you build everything, because the end of Exodus is all the furniture in the tabernacle, how it's supposed to be built, what it's made out of, all that. And he says, make sure you make it just like what was in heaven. So here we have the history now. Now Joshua gives us the story of them entering into the land. By the end of Joshua, all the tribes have been given their allotment, and then Joshua dies. Judges provides why Israel was in tough shape, but Joshua and the leaders die. the next generation did not really grasp the life of faith and obedience to the law, so they ended up essentially doing twice. It says in Judges in chapter 17, and then the very last verse, there was no king in Israel. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. A few other times it says everybody was doing what was right in their own eyes. And that's kind of like the backdrop for Judges. And because, they go through these cycles where, again, I did a book overview on Judges and Joshua that can be helpful for you. And what ends up happening is through these cycles, Israel rebels. One of their enemies oppressed them for so many years. They cry out to God. He raises up a judge. They get delivered. They're delivered for so many years. They fall back into sin. They're overtaken by their enemies. They're oppressed. Then they cry out to God, and they do this cycle. And each time he raises up a judge to deliver them. They're basically, they're kind of like a prophet or whatever, but they're a leader that God raises up and uses them. The judges become increasingly less moral throughout the book. And by the end, you have, Samson, he's great for Sunday school lessons and stuff like that. But, he's a very, very corrupt man who, seemed not to have much of a relationship with God and was had his own rebellion to deal with. But so the book of Ruth occurs at the time of Judges. Again, it's given you the lineage through David, and the principle in Ruth is the Goel, which is the kinsman redeemer. That becomes important because Christ is our kinsman redeemer. He had to be one of us in order to redeem us from our sin. And 1 Samuel gives you the rise of Saul, who is the first king. Samuel is technically the last judge, or the first prophet, however you want to look at him. But technically, he was like the last judge. And he ended up, he anoints Saul. Saul is what the people wanted. He was an utter failure. As you look in the life of Saul, Saul's life is symptomatic of an insecure person. All the symptoms and the problems he had was because he wanted the respect, and he wanted credit from the people. Everything was horizontal with Saul. David was only concerned about what God thought. He wanted the respect of God and the credit from God. So, he wasn't looking for the accolades of people, and that was the difference. David was God's king. Saul was the people's king. And then, David becomes the king that all the others are measured by, not because he was a perfect man, but because he never had a different God, and he was always loyal to God, Jehovah God or Yahweh. And and then 2 Samuel really focuses on how David comes into power, expands the kingdom. First king, David dies, and then, Solomon takes over. And then, Solomon's son Rehoboam, between Solomon's corruption and the end of his life, and then Rehoboam's corruption, God offers a guy named Jeroboam the opportunity to take 10 tribes north to oversee Israel and have part in the Messianic kingdom. His line, Jeroboam's line, if he stays faithful, that lasted about 5 minutes. As soon as he got the 10 tribes up north, he created the golden calves for Dan and Bethel, those cities, because he didn't want the people to return down south and go to the temple. So we have the kingdom splits. It goes from a united kingdom with Saul, David, and Solomon to a divided kingdom, Rehoboam on the south with Judah and Benjamin, the first Jeroboam up north with the other 10 tribes. and then that carries through until they both go into captivity. So Second Kings gives the continuation of the divided kingdom. First Chronicles is an overlay, really, starting at First Samuel through Kings. Second Chronicles focuses on Solomon's reign out to the end, where both north and south are taken into captivity. So now the book of Ezra. This is not chronological. This is how they're laid out in the Bible. But the book of Ezra is the people returning back from the Babylonian captivity. So they're there for 70 years, Judah and Benjamin. They come back, and the book of Ezra deals with them. Esther occurs between chapters 6 and 7 of Esther, and it's focused on the people left in Persia, which is Iran geographically, but Persia at the time. And Persia was actually friendly to Israel up until 1979, and Ayatollah Khomeini was put in by Jimmy Carter. What a debacle that was. Jimmy Carter, I don't think, knew really what he was doing, but which is why he was one of the worst presidents we had. But nice guy, poor leader, and put the Ayatollah in, and he had the globalists around him, Henry Kissinger and all them, that advised him that it was the right thing to do. He went and did it, and to try to stem the communist effect that Russia was having by stirring up the college kids in Iran to demonstrate against the Shah, who was the king, who was very, very pro-American, wanted to be like the West, wanted to basically bring the American culture into Iran, was enjoying everything, a big friend to the U.S. And then, the communism always infiltrates a country by getting the weakest-minded people, which normally is college students. And college students are very malleable. They think they know more than what they know. They haven't been alive long enough to really experience much or know anything more than what they read in a book or than what their professor tells them. So they're easy to control. So the communists always focus on them, which is why they do in our own colleges, okay? And, the Marxists get a hold of them. And so Russia had them, doing all these demonstrations in Iran to demonstrate against the Shah. Jimmy Carter ends up getting convinced to take Ayatollah Khomeini, who was in exile and out of Iran, who was an extreme Muslim, puts him back in power, hoping, because he said, I'll neither be East or West. In other words, he wouldn't let communism in. But of course he lied. And as soon as he got into power, killed all the army that were, loyal to the Shah, and then went to the college kids and killed all them. He doesn't need them anymore. And if they're easy to manipulate for him, they'll be easy to manipulate against him. This is basic stuff. But again, if you don't learn history, you'll repeat the worst things of it. And so that's what happened. But Persia was friendly to Israel. You see that in the book of Esther, except for, of course, Haman, who was a leftover Amalekite that was trying to get rid of them. And Nehemiah, where Ezra doesn't actually return until chapter 7. It's Joshua, the high priest, and Zerubbabel, the governor, that are really the focus, the first 6 chapters of the book of Ezra. And then Nehemiah arrives back. He rebuilds the walls of Jerusalem in 52 days. So easy to remember, there's 52 weeks in the year. And then works with Ezra to develop the nation. Ezra builds the people. Nehemiah builds the walls. Poetry. So we have Job, which really talks about the life of suffering in a person of faith. In other words, not turning their back on God because of circumstances and all that. And though things temporarily may go bad for people, in the end, God always comes through because he's faithful. Hebrew poetry is not like English poetry where it's rhymes. It is like like philosophical principles that are, and when I say philosophical, things that we can reason out in our minds, they are put into either a story that is true, or and viewed from the place of analysis to show righteousness and wickedness. And you always have either these contrasts that are balanced out. So the balance isn't in rhyming, the balance is in concept. And the and then obviously faith in God is always seen as the real focus and the primary goal in life, because everything else is deceptive and it is an attempt to get people off that path. There are many things that are alluring that will try to bring you off the path of your faith and walk with God. In Job, it was obviously the circumstances and the criticism of his friends and everything else. Psalms, whether it's Moses, David, Asaph, who was a song writer or whatever, Solomon, whoever wrote them, whichever ones they wrote, again, there's the cry out to God. So they're really focused their songs towards God, crying out for help, and then God helps, or kind of despair because it looks like God's not going to help, but then he comes through, or singing about God's past accomplishments and faithfulness to Israel, and so therefore he should be trusted. Again, it's like Job. Ultimately, we should trust God, but it just gets into different detail. Proverbs, more horizontal, person to person, why you should walk with God, and provides wisdom. Now, some of it is specifically it's all written for people under the law, but so much of Proverbs really transfers because they are moral truths that don't change with covenant. Wickedness is wickedness, whether you're under the law or you're under grace. Faithfulness is faithfulness, whether you're being faithful to the law and that's how you're relating to God, or whether you're a Christian relating to God now through the Lord Jesus. So, but faithfulness to God has a moral component to it. And, so Proverbs are great for, learning how to exercise wisdom in relating with other people. Ecclesiastes, that's more Solomon. Ecclesiastes means the preacher. So Solomon's writing about, and he had the money to do it. He tried to find basically fulfillment in the world. Again, the world and what it offers is pitted against the life of faith and obedience to God. But, no matter what he tried to gain some internal fulfillment, he realized in the end, everything is, wickedness and vexation of spirit. And the only thing that had any value is to love God and observe his commandments, right? Like the Old Testament says. And then the Song of Solomon is Solomon pictured with his bride. So it certainly does, speak of Christ and the church in that way. But again, it's a relationship. And again, the contrast between what a relationship should and shouldn't be in marriage. We move through the prophets. The major prophets are major based on their length. Isaiah, 66 chapters. They call it the mini Bible because the Bible is 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 in the New. You go through Isaiah up to chapter 39. There's a lot of judgment, and then you hit chapter 40. And the last 27 chapters is really focused more on God's grace and deliverance. So, but there's much in Isaiah about the Messianic kingdom, the Messiah himself, how all that's going to work out. And he writes about 800 BC. And Jeremiah prophesies actually right into the captivity time period, so he's much later. But again, he's a major prophet because of his length. Prophesied during a number of different kings. They tell you what kings they prophesy during, in the first chapter and verse of their book. Okay, and Jeremiah, again, just great lessons, but speaks a lot about the coming Babylonian captivity and what that's going to mean for Israel, but that God will eventually recover them, and that the present covenant that they're under, the law, will be replaced by a new covenant. But again, that is pushed off into the future when the Messianic kingdom is brought in. Lamentations is Jeremiah sitting on the Mount of Olives, looking over Jerusalem, watching it be destroyed, and lamenting, thinking about the whole thing and providing his thoughts. Ezekiel, his ministry is really to the captives in Babylon. He exists into the captivity and preaches to the people in the captivity of why they're there, gives them understanding of what was happening in them getting there. In other words, what people couldn't see, God is revealing to the captives, because, again, they're just kind of watching the outside and seeing things happen, and now they've been taken away by Babylon, and like, why did all this happen? And, they might have heard some of the prophets, but Ezekiel lays it out, and then lays out their recovery, and into the 40s chapters where it's talking about eventually, again, the Messianic kingdom. Daniel, the next, again, so critical, giving you the prophecy of the four world governing kingdoms, and from Babylon to Media, Persian, Greece, and then Rome. But he provides so much information that it really needs to be studied in parallel to the book of Revelation. It has a lot of connective pieces. And, Jesus references Daniel in Matthew 24 in the Olivet Discourse in verse 15, when he talks about the abomination of desolation. He said, spoken of by Daniel the prophet. So obviously it hasn't happened yet, which I'm sure, is certainly going to mess up some of the people, like the covenant theologians that don't believe in a literal millennial reign, and some of the historical millennialists that think the millennial reign is happening now. Hope you're enjoying it. So, the book of Daniel is just so well laid out, and so prophetic, that the liberals try to say that, well, he couldn't have wrote that kind of detail until, around 165 BC, after all these things happened and everything. That's a little tough when they translate it into Greek in about 250, 300 BC. So, they translated it into Greek because it was already in Hebrew, and Alexander the Great had conquered the known world, and Greek was the language that everybody was speaking. It was like, how most of the world speaks English, apparently, except for in America anymore. But the important thing is that Daniel was written around 600, into the 500s, and then the information was for then into later years, and the accuracy is, well, it's God's word, so it's no surprise, but it is phenomenal. Minor prophets, only because of their length. Hosea is seen, this is God's relationship with Israel, seen through Hosea's relationship with his wife. He marries a girl. She becomes a prostitute, an adulteress. She goes out with all these other lovers. Eventually, her life is reduced down to nothing. She becomes a slave. God says to Hosea, go and buy her back now that nobody else wants her and she's available for the half a price of a slave or whatever. Then go get her, bring her back home and love her. And interestingly enough, God's going to do the same with Israel. So no matter how bad Israel gets, God is not going to abandon them. That's what the book is about. And again, it pushes off to the future, eventually to the Messianic reign, which will be fulfilled through the nation of Israel. Joel, again, prophesied about mainly to Judah and about the coming invasion. He talks a lot about the end times. He's prophesying about the Spirit being poured out on Pentecost, about, Paul pulls out of Joel for Romans 10, about, you believe in the Lord, you be saved. In Joel chapter 2, verse 2, it's connecting to the tribulation period. He calls it the worst period of time that'll exist. You can only have one worst periods, right? Jeremiah 30, verse 7, that's the worst. Daniel 12, 1 and 2, that's the worst. Joel 2, that's the worst. Jesus in Matthew 24, 21, that's the worst. Like they're all speaking about the same time. You can only have one worst time, and that's it. But Joel really emphasizes the judgment prophetically in the invasion, the one that was coming upon Judah and then off into the future. Amos really talks about the judgment of the surrounding nations. He was a prophet from down south. He was a fig picker of the sycamore fruit. It probably had purple hands. He went up north to prophesy up there. God couldn't find a faithful prophet up north, apparently, so he had to get down south and get one. But he talks about national accountability. Everybody is judged based on their responsibility as a nation. Now, it's interesting, Israel is judged based on their breaking of the law and their relationship to the law, where the surrounding nations are judged based on basic morality that they should know better in their treatment of Israel. Isn't that interesting? So, what they should and should not have known, they're judged accordingly. And Obadiah predicts the doom of Edom. Edom is the offspring of Esau, grown into a nation, and he gives all the reasons for their judgment. As a matter of fact, Obadiah is quoted in 2 Samuel, almost word for word, near the end of the book. Jonah, everybody knows Jonah. He's the rebellious prophet that didn't want to go to Nineveh. Well, Jonah lived in northern Israel, was familiar with the Assyrians, probably knew, fellow Israelites or maybe even his own family that could have been killed or maimed or tortured by the Assyrians. They were so evil. And the capital of Assyria was Nineveh. So Jonah, being a patriot and a faithful prophet up until that time, he ends up going the opposite way. When God says, I want you to go to Nineveh, he goes, nope, I'm going the other way. Gets a ticket, gets on a boat, and you know the story. God gets him there with the fish, spits him out on the shore. He goes through, he announces judgment, no opportunity for anything other than he just says, hey, 40 days, it's over for you guys. And then in chapter 4, after the king says, hey, maybe God will be merciful to us. So he has everybody repent. And God forestalls his judgment. And then Jonah's mad at him in chapter 4. He says, I knew it. I knew this was the reason that I didn't want to come, was because I knew that you would extend mercy to these people if they repented, and I wanted to see them destroyed, right? So, though I can't agree with him, I can understand where he's coming from. I get the same sin nature. I know what patriotism feels like. So, now the message about Jonah, churches use it as, missions. We should be willing to go and all that stuff, which is great. But the actual, the intent of the message is, again, he was living up north, and he was actually preaching to the northern kings. And he was there during the second King Jeroboam. And let's see. And I'll find it here. 1 second. Probably should have looked it up. Saved you a little time. Yeah. All right. So in 2 Kings 14, talking about Jonah under the reign of the second Jeroboam, it says in verse 25, he restored the coast of Israel from the entering of Hamath, this is talking about Jeroboam, unto the sea of the plain, according to the word of the Lord, God of Israel, which he spoke by the hand of his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, so you know it's the one in the book, the prophet, which was of Gath-hepher, which is in Zebulun, a little bit north of Nazareth. So he's up in the northern part of Israel. Now, so Jonah was a good prophet. He was faithful, obviously. And he helped northern Israel by speaking to the kings. But none of those kings were good kings. All 20 of them were idolatrous. But the message was, if God will turn and turn his judgment away, if a pagan king repents in dust and ashes and the people repent, these evil, wicked people, what do you think he's going to do in northern Israel if they turn away and if they repent? So if they repent, God won't judge them either, because judgment was coming. And but they didn't get the message, obviously, and went into captivity to the Assyrians in 722 BC. So Micah, he spoke really to the southern kingdom. He lived around the time of Isaiah, and his focus was really the corrupt leaders, the civil and the spiritual leaders, which are the princes and the priests. Interestingly, he gives the birthplace of the Messiah in chapter 5. So we know where the Messiah would be born, Nahum. So about 100 years or so after the Assyrians repented, then judgment was brought back to Assyria, and this time they were judged. And the Babylonians defeated them. The Assyrians were more around the area of Turkey and into kind of the Iraq area, and Babylon was, in the region of Iraq, kind of. So they're always moving the line between them because they're always fighting, but eventually Babylon overtook them. And that was the book of Nahum speaks about that judgment. Habakkuk, again, he provides us what's going to happen with Babylon coming down. He's shocked that God would use Babylon. But God uses Babylon, and um, you know, Habakkuk 2:4 becomes a verse that's quoted by Paul in Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews, that the just will live by faith. Zephaniah talks about the day of the Lord, speaking of the day coming upon, uh, you know, Judah in the Old Testament, but pushes off to the future in the New, in the tribulation period. Haggai talks about rebuilding the temple. Both him and Zechariah prophesy within 2 months of each other, and they are during the time of Ezra, when they're rebuilding the temple, because when the Jews came back in the book of Ezra, they laid the foundation, got some persecution, and then stopped. For 14 years, stopped. So God raised up Haggai and then Zechariah a couple of months afterwards and encouraged them to start rebuilding. And then Zechariah has more prophecies out into the future than Haggai. Haggai does have one that he mentions about the second temple that they were going to be building, and how it would be more glorious than Solomon's, even though some of the people didn't think so, because Solomon's was decked out with so much gold and everything. But the thing that made the second temple so important was the Messiah was going to be standing in it. So God himself would come, in a sense, and stand right in the temple, in humanity. I apologize for keep going to my eye. I must have something in it, so I'll deal with that afterwards. But Zechariah has 8 visions, and there are prophecies that are laid out for them at the time to encourage the rebuilding and then off into the future. And Malachi, last prophet of the Old Testament, chronologically, though in the English Bible, not in the Hebrew Bible, he ends up about 90 years after Nehemiah. It really has to kind of deal with the same things that Ezra and Nehemiah dealt with the lack of faithfulness of the priests, the people intermarrying with the pagans. And then Malachi gives great prophecies regarding John the Baptist into the future, and the coming of Elijah, before the day of the Lord. So that was not John the Baptist. John the Baptist came in the spirit and power of Elijah. He had the same kind of ministry, but the actual one will arrive in the tribulation period. So that is the Old Testament. We're almost at an hour. I apologize. I thought I could get it done a little quicker, but I know that's very, very brief. But as you look through the books, it should simplify them a little for you. I mean, you can get the same thing I'm telling you probably for the most part out of a good study Bible that gives a good book introduction. There's a great Bible for those of you who like the old King James. I don't know if it's still available. I think it is. Hold on, let me get it. I have it right here. This this is the old King James, but this King James Study Bible, this thing is great. If you like the old King James, they got a ton of notes. It actually goes with the King James Version Bible commentary. They're all the same people. A lot, for the most part, I believe they're all from Liberty University. And what a great, I like the layout. I think I have about 10 Schofield Bibles or whatever, but if you see the layout here, I don't know if I can get this up on the screen, but I like the way it's laid out. I have this is the Schofield I use, Like this is where I read from with the prophet Jonah. But see how it's got a similar layout. The text. I like the. I mean, it's just my own preference. I like the center column reference. Um, you know, that they have here, and I believe they still sell it, but it's called the Nelson King James Version Bible or King James Study Bible. Um, it's it's a great deal, but for New King James, Nelson has a New King James Study Bible that's got like I think they advertise it's got like 25,000 or 2,500 or 5,000 notes in it. It's a ton of notes. You can get it in New King James. Good study Bible, get a lot of information. I know David Guzik just come out with a Bible. Those of you who like David Guzik, he's got a study Bible now. It's kind of hernia-inducing to pick it up. It's actually kind of heavy. It's a good-sized Bible, but again, bunch of notes in it. You got to remember the notes are not inspired. It's just the text, but it's always good to have a good study Bible. One of the things I like about the old Schofield is they give you at the top of the page, top of the center column, they give you the dates. Everybody has a preference to whatever. I mean, the goal is to know the Bible. So whatever Bible you get, you just don't want to read it like a storybook. You want to dig in, find out what the book backgrounds are and where they fit, and why God is saying through the prophets what they are or whatever. So anyways, hopefully this is good. So we'll start on the New Testament next time, and until then, may God richly bless you as you continue to study his word.